Joining us to discuss all this are two of the best political minds at CBS News, political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns and political director Finn Gomez. So good to have you both with us. Finn, we'll begin with you. When you think back to this week and recent days and all of these Trump legal developments, as political director at CBS News, what's your assessment about whether the Trump legal news moves the political needle just weeks ahead of the midterm elections?
Well, Bob, Trump is still the dominant figure in the Republican Party, and he's still having an impact. Doesn't move the political needle. It's still a little early to say. Even though he's become the subject of all these investigations, there's been a lot of attention on these investigations. It hasn't really impacted his standing in the Republican Party. It stayed basically the same at the same level since earlier this summer. But so far, there are a lot of headlines, and there's also a lot of just a sort of a wait-and-see approach, if you will, from the Republican Party on just how impactful this will be 47 days away from now.
It's a smart point, Finn. And Caitlin, you've been on the road covering candidates. You were recently in Kansas covering issues like abortion rights. And even in a ruby red state like Kansas, it's not Trump that's on everybody's mind all the time. There are other issues like abortion rights, like the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think heading into this election, we're really seeing kind of a tale of two elections. You talk to Democrats, and it's abortion is the driving factor that they think has changed the dynamics of this race. You talk to Republicans in same campaigns who say, no, 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 it's the inflation and the economy that still remain. And that bears out in our polling, too. And so you kind of have this dynamic where people are kind of running on two different fronts. How does Trump play into all of that? I've been watching to see kind of how other Republicans are reacting to this news, not reacting to it, or going about their daily lives with it. And it's interesting to look at some of those potential 2024 candidates, people like Nikki Haley, who is in New York. The UN is going on right now. She's been trying to get out on that issue. You have Glenn Youngkin, for example, the Republican governor of Virginia. He's out on the campaign trail. Ted Cruz.
Trump, or are they kind of sidestepping Trump?
You know, it's one of those things where when you talk about these investigations, you saw all of them kind of rally to his defense, but they're still kind of making their own moves because, as you and I have talked about before, this is so uncertain how this all plays out. And so they kind of want to be ready in the wings in case he doesn't run, in case, the midterms don't pan out well for Republicans and Trump gets blamed in some way. So it's interesting to kind of watch their movements. They're kind of going about it as if they're preparing their own futures, but not enough to kind of cross him.
That's a good point. And Finn, I think so much about Governor Youngkin of Virginia. He reminds me of Chris Christie back in 2011 when Christie was the Republican star of the moment. People wanted to try to recruit him to run in the donor class to run in 2012. He ultimately decided not to run for the Republican nomination that year. But Finn, you brought up an interesting point about how Trump remains the dominant force. Voters' minds haven't changed. There's a new poll out today from the New York Times and Siena College, and it says the American public's views of Trump have remained remarkably stable in recent months, even as he faces multiple investigations. Overall, the Times wrote 44% of voters viewed him favorably, while 53% viewed him unfavorably, effectively unchanged since the last poll. That gets to your point, Finn, about these political dynamics where it's such a firestorm seemingly in the headlines on some of the Trump legal questions. But the polling shows, at least from CBS and the New York Times Siena today, that there are other issues that are crowding out this story.
Absolutely. I just want to make one quick point, Bob, actually. Earlier this summer, when you mentioned Youngkin, I remember earlier this summer when Trump first came to Washington, it was the first time he came back since he left office. I ran into a senior Trump advisor who his first question out of his mouth is, how real is Youngkin? So I think Youngkin is having an impact even in Trump world, and you're seeing that with Youngkin. When it comes to Trump, there's still also, like I mentioned, there's this wait-and-see approach, not only inside the Republican Party, but also in Trump world. They're watching and seeing how these investigations will play out and how it will, the trajectory of Donald Trump looking past 22, how this impacts that as well. So, I mean, even though the polling has not changed in recent months, some are still seeing that there could be some significant impact in that trajectory that we've mentioned.
And let's not forget, Caitlin, that Trump world is not just monitoring the legal and political things at play right now. This is a movement that has, in recent weeks, recent months, recent years, been cozying up in some respects to the QAnon conspiracy movement. The former president has amplified the QAnon movement on his social media platform. At recent rallies, you see a lot of QAnon movement supporters attending Trump rallies as well. What are we witnessing on that right wing of the Republican Party inside the Trump movement right now when it comes to QAnon and extremism?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that Trump is not only kind of, giving some dog whistles. I mean, there are overt symbols. You mentioned this rally in Pennsylvania, for example, that he had last weekend. And what I think is interesting, too, is to kind of watch whether and how other Republicans engage in that behavior or try to kind of stay away from it. If you look at someone like Doug Mastriano, who we've talked about before, running for governor in Pennsylvania, he's very much, tied to that and embracing that.
Well, he's not embracing QAnon necessarily, but he's seen as someone supportive of kind of Christian nationalism.
Yes.
His Christianity is at the forefront of how he's framing his own Republican candidacy.
But when you look at kind of the conspiracy nature of QAnon, there's that element, but there's kind of this broader sense in the Republican Party of not to disavow it too much among some of these candidates who are loyal to Trump.
Finn, any thoughts on what we're witnessing with some of these elements out there on the campaign trail?
I think, as you mentioned, you saw Trump in that rally actively embracing the supporters of the QAnon conspiracy. He recently shared an illustration on his social media platform during that rally, and even played that music that was maybe a hat tip to the QAnon conspiracy. You even saw that strange hand gesture, which could have been part of that as well. But it's something where he could be doing this to overtly court them in a way. He recognizes that there may be there is an element in his base. Not sure how significant the size of it, but it does exist, and it's sort of a hat tip to them that memes that he puts out that are it's in essence trying to say that I see you, and I see that you're there, and that you support me.
And when we talk about what will break through in the midterm elections, Caitlin, there's a lot of talk about whether the January 6th committee, which had these hearings in recent months, will break through with its own work. Next week, there's going to be a hearing on September 28th, 1 p.m. Our colleague Scott McFarland spoke earlier today with one of the committee members, Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Let's listen.
The committee announced another hearing. You spent a lot of time over the last few weeks working behind the scenes. Why is it important to have another public, nationally televised hearing?
There were some loose ends that we wanted to wrap up from the prior hearings, including the disappearance of thousands of texts in the Secret Service and in the Department of Defense. There were some other lingering questions.
What are you going to be watching with the January 6 hearings? Because we all have been paying attention to Trump legal, the grand juries in Washington, the Georgia grand jury, but it's the January 6 committee ultimately that's going to be out front in the spotlight.
Yeah, I mean, what has been so fascinating about the committee is that we've all known about, what happened on January 6th, right? But what the committee has been able to unveil is that they've been able to talk to Republicans and feature Republicans, people who worked in the Trump administration, who wanted him to win again. And they have, the information that they have brought forth has been very revealing. But the bigger question is, does this have any political consequences for the former president or his supporters? And I don't think that we've seen that yet. And that's why I'm watching to see kind of what the results of the midterms are, because he has endorsed lots of candidates this cycle. A lot of them have been successful. If they are not successful in the general election, does that give Republicans pause to say, okay, maybe we should look at some of these other candidates candidates in the wings, DeSantis, Haley, and another person. And that's why it's really interesting to just watch what other Republicans are doing, because there is a lot, a lot of Republicans have bashed this committee, have tried to say from the start that it's political. But if it turns out that something happens from one of these investigations, it's just a big unknown. So, whether this gives some other Republicans some room to kind of come to the forefront and say, I'm Trump, but without the baggage, that's kind of where the jockeying, I think, is.
Finn, any thoughts on January 6th? When I spoke to Vice President Harris a few months ago, she said democracy is the issue for the midterm elections. You stay close to the campaign committees in both parties. What are Democrats saying in the closing stretch about how they're going to talk about this?
Well, I mean, you see that when this next hearing comes out, it's going to be about 40 days until the November 8th election. So they're hoping that it does have an impact, that it does sway some of the independent voters. You're seeing some impact on register with them. But earlier in the summer, we did have a poll that showed that among Republicans and among the Trump's base, it really has not been having that impact, as Caitlin mentioned. So will it have an impact come 47 days? That's also something we are going to be watching and seeing if that helps sway some voters, especially in these crucial battleground states.
Caitlin Huey-Burns and Finn Gomez, thanks very much, and stick with us.